On July 31, 1992, Thai Airways Flight 311 was on approach to Kathmandu, Nepal, when a minor technical problem forced the crew to abort the landing and reposition. The issue was resolved in under 2 minutes. The aircraft was fully airworthy. Both pilots were experienced. And yet, within minutes of that brief disruption, the aircraft was flying directly toward the Himalayas, and nobody in the cockpit or in air traffic control realized it. Thai Airways International was established in 1960 as Thailand's national carrier. By 1992, it operated more than 60 jet aircraft, including Boeing 747s and Airbus A300s, and flew millions of passengers annually across Asia and beyond. Flight 311 that morning operated an Airbus A310, a twin-engine wide-body jet built in 1987, registered as Buri Ram within the Thai Airways fleet. The aircraft had accumulated no significant technical history. At the time, the A310 had never been involved in a fatal accident. Flight 311 would change that. The flight departed Bangkok's Don Mueang International Airport at 10:30 a.m. local time, bound for Tribhuvan International Airport in Kathmandu. On board were 99 passengers representing 14 nationalities, Nepali, Japanese, and European travelers among them, along with 2 pilots and 12 cabin crew. 113 people in total. The Bangkok-Kathmandu route was one Thai Airways operated regularly. It had been completed without incident many times before. In command was Captain Prita Sudamai, 41 years old, with 13,200 total flight hours, approximately 4,400 of them in the A310, and 1,700 as captain on that type. He was also a qualified flight instructor, experienced, assertive, and accustomed to taking an active role in managing the flight. In the right seat was First Officer Bontawat Bunyawi, 52, with 14,600 total hours and around 4,200 in the A310. Bunyawi was older than the captain and had more total flying experience. He had previously been evaluated for promotion to captain, but had not been advanced, with assessments noting concerns about decision-making and leadership under pressure. The dynamic in the cockpit that morning was therefore unusual. An experienced first officer who had not been deemed suitable for command, paired with a captain who was both a line pilot and an instructor, and who tended to dominate the management of the flight. To understand what happened on approach, it's necessary to understand where they were going. Tribhuvan International Airport sits inside a valley at approximately 4,400 feet above sea level, surrounded on all sides by terrain. To the south, ridgelines reach 9,000 feet. To the north, the Himalayas rise well above 20,000 feet. 8 of the world's 14 peaks over 8,000 meters are within Nepal's borders. In 1992, Kathmandu had no radar. Air traffic controllers could not track aircraft on a screen. They relied entirely on position reports transmitted by pilots over the radio. If a pilot reported the wrong position, there was no independent way to detect it. There was also no precision instrument landing system. Instead, aircraft used a non-directional beacon approach, navigating toward a ground-based transmitter, following a published procedure that told crews what altitude to maintain at each distance from the airport. The pilots tracked their position and descent rate manually. Nothing guided the aircraft automatically to the runway. The standard approach from the south, known as the Sierra approach, required aircraft to follow a specific inbound track and descend along a path considerably steeper than a typical commercial approach. To fly it safely, the aircraft's flaps had to be fully extended. Thai Airways procedures were explicit on this point. If the required flap configuration could not be achieved, the Sierra approach could not be continued. Conditions on arrival were manageable, but not straightforward. The monsoon season was active. Visibility had fluctuated during the crew's approach. At one point, reduced visibility south of the airport prompted controllers to suggest an alternate runway, before improving conditions allowed the original plan to continue. None of this was unusual for Kathmandu in July. The problem began at around 12:33 p.m. local time, as the crew was established on the approach and descending toward the airport. Captain Sudamai called for flap extension. First Officer Bunyawi moved the flap lever to the 15-degree position. A protection mechanism in the system, designed to prevent overloading in certain conditions, triggered and stopped the flaps from moving. The warning appeared in the cockpit. The required flap setting had not been achieved. Bunyawi attempted the next flap position. The system stopped again. Without the required flap configuration, the Sierra approach could not continue. Sudamai leveled off at 10,500 feet and discontinued the descent. The aircraft was now above its planned altitude and closer to the airport than the procedure anticipated. Too close and too high to simply resume the approach from where it had been interrupted. Sudamai contacted Kathmandu Approach Control and stated that due to a technical issue, he intended to divert to Calcutta. The controller acknowledged. Within seconds, Bunyawee retracted the flaps entirely and cycled the system. When he advanced the lever again, the flaps moved normally and reached the required position. The fault had cleared. Approximately 90 seconds had passed since Sudamai declared the diversion. He immediately came back on the radio and canceled the Calcutta request. Instead, he wanted to turn left toward a waypoint called Romeo and restart the Sierra approach from the beginning. This is where the situation became complicated. Romeo was located approximately 41 nautical miles south of Kathmandu. The Sierra approach procedure's initial fix, the point where the inbound track begins, was only 16 nautical miles from the airport. On the approach chart Sudamai was using, both points appeared in close proximity because the chart was not drawn to scale. A small note on the chart indicated this, but the visual impression created by the diagram may have led the captain to treat Romeo as the nearby approach entry point, rather than a distant southern waypoint. From the controller's perspective, Romeo was off the edge of his working chart. Routing the aircraft there would require it to travel in the opposite direction from normal traffic flow. The controller acknowledged the general intent to restart the approach, but issued instructions consistent with a much shorter repositioning, telling the crew to report at 10 nautical miles at 9,500 feet, which implied a standard overhead circuit, not a long track to the south. Sudamai heard something different. He believed he was waiting for clearance to proceed toward Romeo. He repeated the request several times. The controller kept restating approach instructions. The two were not understanding each other. Part of the difficulty was language. The controller's English was limited. The technical and procedural exchange taking place, involving waypoint names, distances, and intentions, was difficult to parse under those conditions. Meanwhile, Sudamai had taken over all radio communications himself, which meant he was simultaneously flying the aircraft, managing the approach planning, and attempting to resolve the communication impasse. His workload had increased substantially. After several unsuccessful attempts to obtain clearance to proceed toward Romeo, Sudamai made a new decision. He would turn right, complete a 180-degree heading change, and fly south to Romeo on his own. He advised the controller of his intention to climb to 18,000 feet during the turn. The controller rejected the climb. Another aircraft was at that altitude, and instructed Flight 311 to remain at 11,500 feet. Sudamai complied. What followed was the central error of the accident. Using the autopilot, Sudamai initiated a right turn. His intent was a 180-degree reversal to point the aircraft south, but while he was occupied with the radio and the approach planning, the turn continued past 180 degrees. The aircraft completed a full 360-degree circle and rolled out heading northeast, directly toward the Himalayas. Sudamai believed he was heading south toward Romeo. He was heading toward terrain rising to more than 20,000 feet, at an altitude of 11,500 feet, at a speed exceeding 430 kilometers per hour. Neither pilot noticed. The controller, without radar, had no way to see it. Over the next several minutes, indicators of the error were present. Sudamai reported his heading to the controller as 025 degrees, a value that corresponds to northeast, not south. The distance and bearing information the navigation system was showing did not match what the crew expected for a track toward Romeo, because Romeo was now behind them. The crew attributed the discrepancy to the navigation computer rather than their own position. They attempted to re-enter Romeo's coordinates multiple times, and each time the system showed the same result, because the system was correct. The aircraft was flying away from Romeo, not toward it. Bunyawee noticed the northward heading and said something to the captain. Sudamai's response indicated he understood they would be turning shortly. He did not reverse course. Seconds later, the ground proximity warning system activated. The GPWs was designed specifically for this scenario, to alert pilots when the aircraft is in dangerous proximity to rising terrain. The warning was unambiguous. The required response was immediate: maximum climb, away from terrain. Sudamai did not respond to the warning as designed. He believed the aircraft was south of the airport, in an area where terrain warnings could be false alarms near the surrounding ridgelines. His mental picture of the aircraft's position was so far from reality that the warning did not trigger the appropriate response. The warning sounded again. The aircraft was not south of Kathmandu. It was north, inside the Himalayas, at 11,500 feet, descending toward a ridge that rose above that altitude. By the time the crew had visual contact with the terrain ahead, there was no room to maneuver. At 12:45 p.m., Thai Airways Flight 311 struck a steep mountain slope in the Langtang region, approximately 37 kilometers north of Kathmandu, at an elevation of approximately 11,500 feet. The aircraft disintegrated on impact. All 113 people on board were killed. When contact with the flight was lost, initial search operations were concentrated south of Kathmandu, because that was where controllers believed the aircraft had been. The search focused on the wrong area for the better part of the first day. It was only when investigators re-examined the controller's transcript and noted that Sudamai had reported his heading as 025 degrees that the search area was shifted north. Villagers in the Langtang region confirmed they had heard an aircraft and then an explosion on July 31st. The wreckage was located on August 21st, nearly 48 hours after the accident, on a near-vertical slope inside Langtang National Park. The terrain made recovery extremely difficult. Teams were flown in by helicopter and then had to continue on foot. During the investigation, a 62-year-old British test pilot, working on behalf of Airbus, suffered altitude sickness while attempting to reach the crash site and died, making him the accident's final fatality. The investigation was conducted by Nepal's Civil Aviation Authority and drew on the cockpit voice recorder, the flight data recorder, air traffic control transcripts, and the approach charts used by the crew. The findings identified no single cause. What the investigation documented was a sequence of compounding problems, each individually manageable, that together produced a loss of situational awareness, from which the crew never recovered. The flap malfunction, though brief, forced an unplanned abort at a critical moment and placed the aircraft in a position where resuming the approach required significant replanning. The captain's decision to manage all radio communications himself, while simultaneously flying the aircraft and developing a new routing plan, created a workload that left him unable to monitor the aircraft's actual position. The communication failure with the controller, rooted in a combination of language barriers, chart differences, and differing expectations of what had been agreed, meant the repositioning was never clarified or coordinated. The incorrect 360-degree turn went undetected because no one was tracking the aircraft's heading against what it should have been. When Bunyawee noted the northward heading, he did not press the point forcefully enough for the captain to take corrective action. When the terrain warning sounded, the captain's false mental model of the aircraft's position led him to dismiss it. The navigation system was functioning correctly throughout. The GPWs was functioning correctly. The aircraft had no mechanical problems after the flap system was reset. The cause of the accident was entirely the crew's loss of awareness of where the aircraft was, and a set of conditions that allowed that loss to develop and persist until it was too late. Just 59 days after Flight 311, Pakistan International Airlines Flight 268 also crashed on approach to Kathmandu, killing all 167 people on board. 2 fatal accidents at the same airport within 2 months forced a comprehensive review of aviation safety in Nepal. Tribhuvan International Airport received a radar system in 1997, fundamentally changing the nature of approach control at Kathmandu. Controllers could now track aircraft positions independently and identify discrepancies between a pilot's reported position and the aircraft's actual location. More modern approach procedures were implemented in the years that followed, and training standards for air traffic controllers handling mountainous terrain approaches were raised. Thai Airways retired the flight number 311. Pieces of the Bori Ram remain on the slopes of the Langtang Valley today. Trekkers passing through the area occasionally encounter fragments of the aircraft, parts of a fuselage, scattered components that have sat in the same place since July 31, 1992. The Himalayas are remote enough that full recovery was never possible. The accident began with a flap problem that lasted 90 seconds. By the time it was resolved, the crew was behind the approach, the replanning had created a communication failure with the controller, the captain's workload had exceeded what one person could manage, and the aircraft was heading in the wrong direction without anyone realizing it. Each step compounded the one before. None of them alone would have been fatal. Together, they flew 113 people into a mountainside in the dark. This is Disaster Archives.